Great. And if we could move to the next slide, please. All right. As I mentioned, we have a lot to cover today, so we're going to jump right in. I'm Kim Travis with Oregon Housing and Community Services in the Affordable Rental Housing Division. I'm an engagement coordinator helping to support the division with a new centralized application process, and seen many of you in previous meetings. Really appreciate your ongoing engagement with us, and good to see you here today. Going to launch a quick poll just to see if we can get a sense for who's in the room. And hopefully this works. I've had struggles with polls before, so let's see if I can get this to launch. So this is asking who's in the room by region, to your best ability. Where do you work? Where do you represent? It's just good to get a sense of geographic diversity for this meeting today. So thanks for just answering a quick poll here before we get started. All right, I'm just gonna check to see if how we're doing on participants. Got folks, we've got 96. All right, great. Thanks so much for doing a little poll. So let's see, I think I'll end the poll and share results so you can all see who's in the room. Actually, it doesn't look like it's sharing. That's a little glitch. So I'll just name off, we've got about 34% of folks working statewide. Oh, you can see it. Okay, great. See it, there's Zoom magic that it is sharing. Great. Okay. So you all see who's in the room. Looks like we've got pretty decent mix of folks in the room today. So appreciate that. And we'll go ahead and go to the next slide, please, Cassie. Great. So we have got a packed agenda today, and wanted to share, our primary objectives really to provide an update on where we are with proposed recommendations for a new centralized funding application process. We want to get your input and have a discussion around set-aside recommendations. And we're also going to be talking just a bit about subsidy limits later in the meeting. We want to introduce that topic to you today prior to a meeting with Housing Stability Council on Friday. And then we want to make sure you are aware of upcoming engagements. So those are the objectives for our meeting here today, and we'll spend the next 55 minutes or so on our agenda, starting with overview of the centralized resource offering, and current recommendations on the centralized application process. We are going to take some time to do Q&A, so we'll talk through those topics, pause, get your questions. You can use chat or raise your hand. This will be, live Q&A for those topics. Then we'll move into set aside recommendations and spend a bit of time there and have opportunity for Q&A and dialogue around set-asides. Then before we close, we're going to introduce initial information about subsidy limits, and then we'll wrap at 2 p.m. So busy agenda here, but I think we've got it organized here to get through, and really value time to hear from you live or in the chat as well. So I see we've got some chats. I'm going to move to the next slide. Cassie, great. Before we launch into this, wanting to get us grounded in how we show up in our spaces together, we use these agreements internally with our OHCS staff to really just help foster an inclusive environment so everyone feels as though they are free to participate, and that we've got an inclusive environment where folks are engaged in the conversation, speaking their truth responsibly. They're listening to understand the conversation, being willing to do things differently, maybe experience a little discomfort, and expect and accept non-closure. for some of these big topics. We will not be, addressing all things today, but recognize that we are committed to getting back to you and making sure that your input is heard and that we respond as we can to the information that you provide for us. Okay, next slide. I'm going to turn it over to Natasha. She can introduce herself and then share the resources that we have available for 24 and 25.
Great. Thank you, Kim, and thanks to everybody here joining us for this conversation today. My name is Natasha Detweiler-Davy. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Director of Affordable Rental Housing here at OHCS. And so I'm just going to get right into it because I know we have a packed hour here on our hands. So this is really exciting to be able to share these numbers and be able to say to you that we are intending to put out for a centralized application, resource application, nearly $540 million in subsidy to develop affordable rental housing, over 300 million tax credit dollars in 2024. And so this is a different iteration of what we used to call our funding calendar. And I know that we had shared this, discussed this last month at Housing Stability Council, and it is, have gotten a lot of questions, but where's the calendar? And the idea here is that we're bringing all of our resources together into a centralized application process. We will open that this spring. We're aiming for April. And at that time, we will be offering the ability to access this entire slate of resources, which we will work through the process that I'll reflect on in a moment. And so this is essentially the development resources that we will be making available in 2024. Then we can go to the next slide. And then we will also have these additional resources, a little bit different than others. I think we are continuing to see and examine the gaps that projects currently in our pipeline are having. So feel like it will likely be prudent to allocate some resources to address that last gap for pipeline projects that were funded under a different environment. Portfolio stabilization resources to help support projects that are in our portfolio that are struggling with real financial or physical challenges that could maybe be mediated with some asset management interventions through performance improvement plans, and then layering in GHAP capacity, land acquisition program, and pre-development resources. And actually, Cassie, can I go back up to the previous slide? Thank you. So one of the things that I want to kind of call out here, because it is a shift and a change from how we have previously, or how we have been aligning resources specific to serve really deliberate policy intent, where we're identifying the stack within here. We are not doing a lot of that specialized structure, saying that what we want to accomplish, and I think trying to continue to get back to what is our core objective. And core objective is to develop housing, expand the number of units across the state to better address need. We know the need is extensive. We know there are lots of different populations that are needed, and we want to kind of be as broad so that each of the different strategies and funding options can kind of come in through this centralized approach. So general development capital is that. PSH is specifically flagged to serve permanent supportive housing, and those are units to serve those experiencing chronic homelessness. Preservation is a dedicated resource to do preservation funding, and that's through the avenue through which we also are funding the manufactured park preservation efforts. Tribal dedicated resource was really a critical decision to make, because the bulk of our general development capital, those Article 11Q bonds, are really unable to be invested on tribal trust land, because those are Oregon constitutional bonds and sovereign nations and all of those impacts of that resource. And so really identifying resources to hold to be able to be access to develop housing where it is really needed on tribal trust land was critical. And the veteran dedicated capital and ag worker housing dedicated capital are specific legislative resources or statutory funds that are attached to those populations. So really broadly trying to bring all of the resources together to be able to meet and be responsive to the needs in community, and also the projects that you have been able to work to be able to meet the local needs. So to have more of that informed piece back. So then we can go down to go 2 slides, go to the next slide then. And then, so that all of that was 2024. Anything that is not subscribed or fully used in this year would roll over into 2025. And that's then also where we are holding some additional development resources to be able to release next year. And then additional gap resources, that LIHTC pairing capital that would be able to be leveraged with tax credit, LIHTCs, 9s or 4s. So TBDs on the amounts of those tax credits, but I think anticipating at this point, pending federal reform on the 4% side, that might change situations for us. We would be anticipating that 2025 is when we would be next funding new tax credit projects with associated gap resources.
Great.
And
Thanks
I think,
for that
yeah,
overview.
that was my overview.
Yeah, and I put in the chat the link. Here's the link for the web page where you can find all those resources. So we'll move on actually to where we are with current recommendations around the new application process, excuse me. Really looking at how development resources can be non-competitive. So using standard-based evaluation for looking at projects and looking at matching resources to those projects based on those needs. The resources will be managed through a pipeline process where there will be conditional commitments, and then establishing performance benchmarks along the way, knowing that each project is at a different stage, has different variables involved with moving forward through the development pipeline. So we'll be we're in the process of developing a dashboard that will help, public dashboard that will be transparent and show where we are with those conditional commitments. And, really bringing towards this support for smaller and less resourced organizations, particularly looking at pre-development funding, technical assistance, and capacity building to help projects move forward toward final funding. And as mentioned, this is looking at a non-competitive process, which is different from where we've been historically, and looking to incentivize progress with again, projects on different timelines, moving them forward at the pace that they are going as they're achieving different benchmarks, moving those projects forward through the pipeline, and not waiting until, as we have in previous and historic allocation processes, having to wait until the next application cycle, for example. So by looking at this non-competitive and being able to allocate resources and help them move forward through the development process on their timeline. And finally, the last bullet here on this slide in terms of where we are with current recommendations is around set-asides. And so we're going to dig in a little bit more on that topic in a second, but wanted to just pause, take a breath. We've been talking fast, lots of information in terms of the resources that are offered in 2024 through 25, and then these current recommendations. So we'll take a pause for any questions or discussion around those topics so far. So Cassie, if you can move to the next slide. Oh, yes, and we can talk through any questions you have. Feel free, thinking about the process graphic, and Natasha, maybe you want to elaborate a bit on those current recommendations, but get ready with your questions or feel free to post them in the chat.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Kim's overview was the verbal version of this. And so I think our funding process moving from that top blue box where we have a concentrated NOFA process where everything is evaluated in one component, and then either you are selected for funding or you're not selected, and if you're not, you have to wait for the next season of a fund offering to come out. The future state is, again, is this more pipeline aligned process where we are evaluating components, really trying to work in an iteration, establishing benchmarks, but being evaluate components individually, bringing full project pictures together as well, with conditional commitments along the way, and that final funding commitment a little bit later in the process.
Yeah, we've got some questions in the chat. Kevin put 6 questions in the chat. So
good job, Kevin.
Great. Yes. These are great questions too. Question 1, based on the new ARH funding opening in April, anticipated timeline for intake evaluation, funding applications, closing milestones. And, I'll say right off the bat, I know we will be talking about future engagements before we close this meeting. And those are really the next sets of topics, is looking at milestones and ground truthing those with you. I don't know, Natasha, if you want to say anything else about that, when that information will be available.
Yeah, we are, I think let's see, we have been engaging to get input on, a deconstructed 14 different pieces. All of that information is back and working in teams right now to be able to draft the details of the structure and how that rolls out. We do have plans to, as those are, and I think they're getting close, close to there, to be able to kind of do some work group reach out to make sure that we are testing, and then we'll also be working through Housing Stability Council. I think there's 2 pieces. One is what are the umbrellas of what is evaluated at each, and then what are the performance benchmarks coming out of those, and then what are the details of those application documents. So both of those efforts are moving forward, and I think we do not have them right now to share. I do expect that we have them before we are finalizing. And presumably, just like a NOFA, it is not the case where we would be publishing all of it for input before it's released, but we would be evaluating components and getting input on that as we're building it. And so I think that, at a broad swath, I think, and we have some of the other documents around, like, what is the focus and explicit role of each stage of evaluation. So project intake being really general, but then getting into impact assessment, looking specifically at policy alignment, resident services, and equity and racial justice components of projects, very high level at that point. What does that look like in a back of the napkin type strategy? Then financial eligibility is deep dive into pro forma documentation. And so those are the 2 big evaluative pieces. And then the conditional commitments, that performance is around efforts to continue to move your project forward to be ready for the next stage, knowing that we don't want projects sitting in any one step of that for too long. So, and I think we want to, as what we heard clearly from development stakeholders, that each project has its unique circumstances, and each project needs to use their unique circumstances to inform their timeline. So it needs to be a timeline that's informed by the project, but then we need to hold accountability to performing against the timeline anticipated. So I think that's probably not all the answers that you're wanting, and I think it is, on the face of all of those things, is really helpful to understand the questions you have so that we can be queuing up the information in a way to respond to those.
Yeah, Kevin, any follow-up questions?
I mean, I think we're all suspended on some projects and in process on projects, and then thinking of our pipelines. And so we we want to make sure sites we're thinking about buying are going to score. We want to think the programming is going to score.
Yeah.
And even if it's not competitive, we still have to meet a criteria. There's standards and how it's evaluated and so forth. And we consider that to be public policy objectives being, you've created the math for a public policy objective to go into reality. And for us to manifest that public policy objective, we got to know the criteria.
Totally. Yeah, I think that makes complete sense. I wouldn't expect that. We are not planning to say we're shifting completely from what has been priorities for our work in the past. It's looking at it in a different structure, and we're setting it as bars for, you know, that's that standards base. Like, what is it in terms of what you're wanting to accomplish and being in alignment, and overall producing units is a key policy objective here. So I hear that, and I appreciate that specific call out, and we'll make sure that we are responsive to it. In terms of timeliness, I will preview in 15, 20 minutes, probably, kind of approach toward cost and subsidy. On Friday, intend to share in detail with Housing Stability Council all of that, including the first draft of those numbers. And so that is following that conversation up is when you will have numbers in hand to be able to give us input on those. And then we'll be, from a timeline perspective, continuing conversations this Friday with Housing Stability Council, and then moving towards more draft recommendations for March to finalize at the April meeting. So to give us more time, like as much time as we can, to be getting response on anything that we're drafting as recommendations to be able to inform the final. So very soon.
Can I just ask one little
Yeah.
last question? I promise, last question. I think many of us are asking ourselves, we've been told readiness is a huge priority. And therefore, we're kind of racing forward, spending potentially millions of dollars, going as fast as we can to get to readiness. Are there any words of comfort you can give us so that we feel like our race to readiness is money well spent, and that's still going to be an important factor in us being able to line up for financing? Especially, I don't speak for anybody, but I know others also have arranged for lots of gap financing that's sitting there on projects, and those other partners are anxious to know this too, so that we can finalize, close, and get projects built. So that's kind of the in-between phases. But I know that when we're looking for our 2025, 26 pipeline projects, we want to develop the right partnerships and sites to satisfy those as well. But really, right now, the issue about us all racing as fast as we can to get to permit and get ready to close, I think that's what we feel vulnerable, because we don't know that that's really still a goal. Is it?
Yes. Yeah. And so it is absolutely a goal. I think I think our objective is to get the housing into community. We need to be aligning resources to get to that, and readiness is a tremendous component of that. And I think the reason why it's not exclusively readiness is hearing from development that that very deliberately we need to be able to provide that more upfront conditional commitment to be able to get to that place of comfort. And so for those of you that are doing that with projects on your table right now, I think I will affirm that readiness still does matter. And good housing still matters, good objectives, and all of those. And that though we are deconstructing that evaluation of the NOFA process into an impact assessment, financial eligibility, and project commitment, if you have all of those pieces ready, we can be evaluating them all. So it's not a requirement that you slow walk through each step, but that we are allowing the slow walk of each step so that we can be building comfort and understanding of the resources that we can be holding for your projects. But I do think when we open, if you have projects that are able to move and kind of go through that list of diligence or have done that list of diligence already, you'll be ready to fast walk through those stages. And I think, I do see in the, I don't know if it was your questions or others, but what is the duration of an evaluation within each of these steps? And I think obviously we don't have the final thing locked down, but I do think we will be paying time and attention to make sure that we are doing like, it's not a competitive NOFA where we both need to evaluate all of the projects with a in a narrative and all of those, and then assemble and then compete against each other. So the intention is really to be able to have that moment of evaluation not be another 3 months, but that it is able to be accomplished in a more compressed time frame. And I shouldn't commit to what that is exactly at this point, but I don't want to get a bunch of people mad at me internally, but I think timeliness and responsiveness is a foundation for this.
Well, thank you for answering the question about if you have all 4 of these orange with the green arrows pointing up category. If you, whatever stage you're at, you can bring it in where you are and start at that level and kind of combine that. And it's not like, I was kind of imagining something like COVID vaccinations where you're waiting in line and having to go to different stations. Presumably you can bring in what you have, and you'll be able to identify where it is in the process and move it into the process along this process map that you have.
Yeah.
And then other projects that haven't even started can start right at the beginning and go through the concept engagement, acquisition due diligence, and go work more like that if they haven't even started yet. Is that correct? Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. I hogged a lot of time. Appreciate.
No, good discussion. I think there's some questions here we can just answer in the chat, and but let's see. And some we're going to be talking through, including ONA, which is our next topic. So Natasha, on this, we did have a question about the goal for 2025 and standard year offerings, January or April, or what are we anticipating going forward for that?
I think since we don't have, I think as this, we open our centralized resource offering, we will be pivoting or adding qualified allocation plan engagement and alignment into this process. So I think that leaves a little bit to be determined. I don't think that our aspiration is an April opening. I think that we are working to do an implementation, and it felt like the fastest we could get a resource offering open at this point in time. So I think saying that 2025 resources would presumably be turned on in January would be a reasonable approach, in particular around 9%. But I think I need to defer to our future work on the QAP and what that might evolve. And I did also, around tax credits, I do see, Kat, your question around the 2024 PAB commitments, and that list is posted, so we'll make sure that we can add that in there. It looks like.
Yep, got it.
Yeah.
Becky just added that in the chat. Let's move on.
I think there's another pipeline report, so I will find that one.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are you going to be able to find that as you're talking about set aside?
I'm a great multitasker, so it might it might take me a second, but I will get to it. I know I have it like handy in my email, so if I can point. But anyway, we will follow up, Kat, and make sure that before we end this meeting, we have that in there.
Yeah. Quick question from Julie Garver before we move on to set asides. How is the conditional commitment different from a notice of funding award in the prior process?
So conditional commitment is, so we will hold resources. It will not be representing of what we are sure your final funding award will look like. So I think that is a distinction. So when we were evaluating in a NOFA, through the competitive process, we were giving you points based on how much subsidy you were using. We were doing all of the evaluation and decision-making in that iteration. The conditional commitment will say, you know, you've met this. This is determined to be meeting our standards. This is your conditional commitment. You retain your conditional commitment if you are meeting your readiness benchmarks that you've established, that you are tracking through XYZ diligence, and then also that and if you don't, then you will lose your conditional commitment. So there are conditions to it. I think in concept, the reservation letters that you get after a NOFA award has rights to say that we will rescind resources. We very rarely do it, and we very rarely, or we very often have projects that take 2 years after those reservations to actually close and begin construction. So the idea is that we are establishing the conditions, the resources that we will hold, and the conditions through which you will continue to hold them, and that is all based on assumptions that we're moving projects and work forward.
All right. Let's move on to set-asides, and then we'll continue to triage questions in the chat. Thanks all for this great discussion.
Yeah,
So
and I think, I don't know if I think there might have been an interaction on this, but I imagine that we will also be able to use these questions to be able to answer long-term, I mean, in the future, as we are unable to answer all of them live right now.
Yep.
Thanks. Okay, so we're moving to set-asides. So those were all of the resources that would be offered for 2024, and again, aside from having dedicated resources for permanent supportive housing, for tribal projects on tribal trust land, and ag workers and veterans, we haven't really specifically honed in on particular populations. What we are, though, wanting to do here, using a set-aside mechanism, is to use a set-aside to ensure access and opportunity for specific housing type producer types, and to make sure that we're having geographic coverage across the state. This is a little bit, again, it's a little bit of a transition here, and we're wanting to make sure that we are really reflecting back on, again, what our goals and objectives are. We want to create housing, and we also want to make sure that it is spread across the state, that there is housing that, that is funded across all communities. We want to make sure that we are also addressing and prioritizing historically underserved communities and historically underserved and under-resourced organizations. And so maybe we go to the next slide. Before I talk more in detail on what our recommended set-asides are, I think, just want to reflect back that we have heard a lot from you all. Roberto led a discussion in October on set-aside recommendations, and I think you provided great input on aligning these strategic priorities to driving outcomes. And we are also kind of continuing to evaluate and learn around this. And I think one of the big pieces that and I think, I've referenced that we need to dig into the QAP conversation on the tax credits. And one of the big changes in strategies or thoughts that we've been trying to reconcile, and I think this was really raised and supported through engaging with you, is, if what we are wanting to measure is to make sure that we are producing units across the state, should we, instead of looking at the dollars to communities or dollars to regions, should we be looking at the units that we fund to regions or the number of projects that we build? And so I think it is, I think that feels really critical, in particular because we know that there are different development environments that are higher cost or lesser cost. It is, and over all of these, wanting to look at how do we really align those? Where the land cost is higher in some communities, the labor cost is more because you have to travel further. You have resource leverage that you can provide from some local communities. You don't have resource leverage that you can provide in other communities. And so those are all really balancing factors. And I think as we kind of kick off a little bit of the cost conversation today, are trying to also reflect this back into there. But as we are looking at set-asides and how we want to measure success with these, I'm wanting to, number one, I think we want to measure and have active reporting and dashboards of the resources, what stage of commitment are the resources in, and what does that look like on a region by region basis from a dollar perspective. But we also need to be reflecting on that from a unit perspective. And so where we see, for instance, if we're saying, this region should see 15% of the state's resources, it should also see 15% of the state's units that we fund. And so where we see that gap changing, that will need to be an explicit and deliberate reason and means to say we need to move resources to make sure that we can accomplish that parity and make sure that our resources as a whole. And so this will have to be a practice because this is a new strategy, and because we don't know explicitly how many units we're going to end up funding, it feels really challenging to say, let's fund 10 units here and 20 units here and 30 units there, because that's not how projects work. So I think we want to do both, set-asides being around dollars and dollars tied to unit subsidy. So there's a connection there, but that we'll need to evaluate based on that, the reality of what we see for unit production, and use that as kind of on the front side, say that is a deliberate and explicit way or reason why we will need to respond to add resources to those regions that have seen underrepresentation from a production standpoint.
Should we move to the next slide?
I think so.
Yeah.
So, I think that you were going to take this one.
Yeah. Well, this is just, high level of the two types of set-asides that we've recommended, that there would be a geographic set-aside based on the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis that's currently in motion. And there was a question in the chat just about, it's not final yet. And so how does that impact, using something that needs updating, and we're going to talk about that too as we talk through these two different set-aside types. So geographic and then entity type for 25% of resources and units to be funded by a culturally specific organization and or in brackets small rural nonprofit organizations. So that's just setting you up, Natasha, to talk a little bit more in depth in the next two slides about those types. So go to the next slide, please.
Great. And so I think I will continue to walk this through, and then we'll be pausing for discussion questions in just a couple of minutes. Okay, so there is, so as I was talking about set-asides, as holding resources to make sure that we have some geographic representation across these. And I know some of you have been engaged in the huge work and discussions from DLCD and the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis. And there's been various rules and technical advisory committees. It's a very complicated methodology, so I won't go into the detail of that, and I probably shouldn't be the one to do it at this point. But as the state is working to adopt and incorporate the ONA into their work, it felt like as we are looking at allocating resources out to regions, that would be the data through which we could do so. And the regions on the screen were the regions for the ONA. And so the reason for not having 7 different set-asides within our total resources is really to not create too small of slices of the pie, to make sure that we can fund fund real projects and have sufficient resources within each resource bucket. So with that in mind, did pull data on the state's total housing needs, pull that to 3 different regions, Portland Metro, Western regions, and then the Eastern regions, which is that 48% to Portland Metro, 38 to Western, and 14 to the Eastern regions. And so we have heard, that there are some of these questions that have been added to the bottom here. So if Eastern Oregon's population is 16%, why is it only 14%? And I think that is a connection to the data. So if the total need for housing and what percent, so while the Eastern Oregon counties would have 16% of the state's population, it was in total need of 14%. And then the next comment is something that we have been getting as well as we've been going through this work of, should it actually not be from that ONA work, the state's percentage of total housing needs, but should we instead look at the data on the underproduction from the ONA? And so and I think that is another data point that would also be completely logical to incorporate. And so that does shift resources to some extent. Portland Metro would go to 35%, Western Oregon 47%, and Eastern Oregon 17%. And so that's something that, as we are getting input and reflecting that back into final recommendations, will be interesting and important to hear from everybody about what feels like the right descriptive data to be able to use to inform where we allocate resources. And so that will also be a conversation that I bring to Housing Stability Council. And I think I see that Laura, the question in the chat on the region. So Portland Metro on the map on your screen, the orange, yes, or the colors I see them as, is Portland Metro. The Western regions are North Coast, Willamette Valley, and Southwest. And then Eastern is Deschutes, Northeast, and Southeast.
Let's pause here. We do have someone with their hand up. So Carmen, do you want to go ahead and ask your question? We're going to pause for additional questions in a second, but you've been very patient. So go ahead.
Thank you. It's actually regarding the 25% set aside for culture specific organizations.
Okay.
We haven't there yet, so I'll just hold on to review that.
Great. Maybe we can go to the next slide then. Great. Okay, so then is the set aside. And so this is, again, we're looking at geographic diversity in the regional allocation, and then we have put forward a recommendation for a 25% set aside of resources and units to be developed by culturally specific organizations and or small nonprofit rural organizations. And so this is really the why of this is to make sure that we are prioritizing investments to underserved communities and organizations, and so are thinking through it in that vein. Would need to be adding specific definition about who is able to access that and what types of partnerships would be available to it. The question, is it off the top or by regions? And, candidly, this was a place of conversation. And so I've been really interested in all of the input and information that we've gotten in response to date. And I think this recommendation is at this point an off the top 25% set aside. Again, in alignment with equity and racial justice, wanting to make sure that we are prioritizing investments that serve culturally specific organizations, the populations that they are organized to serve, and BIPOC underserved communities, as well as rural underserved communities. So this is effectively the strategy to do that work. And I think, again, tracking and measuring this, we need to have a really clean and robust basically like on a web page where we're really tracking this. We have already initiated work with our division and the research team to build that dashboard. So do intend, as we launch this, to have an active dashboard that is tracking that, again, where our conditional commitments being made across all of the set-asides and in what phase all of those projects are.
All right, thank you. Let's take some questions. We do have a lot in the chat, and I think that maybe developing a FAQ or some way to make sure that we are responding to all this, we'll be doing that for sure. And Andy, you've got your hand up, so why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, so the definition of small rural nonprofit, would a nonprofit arm of a housing authority count if it's kind of, it's a small housing authority like mine?
And then we also have a question similar in the chat about CHODOs. Would they be considered eligible nonprofits? So
I think those are both important and critical questions that we will need to respond to as we share draft definitions. I think generally, I think we have had various funding solicitations and efforts that have relied on a culturally specific organization and small rural nonprofit definition. And so I think I'll probably summon those as initial start point, but I think having clear answers to those specific questions, both about CHODOs and housing authorities, I think we'll need to follow up on that. Thanks so much, Andy and Jillian.
We have a question from earlier in the chat about any organizations that meet the culturally specific definition outside of Metro. Is that something that you can take, or
Which
it was asked a few minutes ago in the chat? Culturally specific definition.
Okay, so we do have, and we can share and reference, there's a definition, an adopted definition of culturally specific organization, and those are, that's kind of agnostic to whether it's urban or rural, the culturally specific organization definition. And I think adding definition and clarity to, if you're a culturally specific organization developing in partnership with another organization, either, it could be a housing authority or a for-profit or other nonprofit developer. And I think, we will add specificity to really when is it that the resources would be pulled from the set aside versus the regional allocation. Again, that's a distinction because we're pulling this resource off the top versus pulling it within each of the regions. So we will add some clear logic to that with the intent of wanting to really have, from a foundational point, the reason for this specific set aside. It is critical that all of our projects prioritize equity and racial justice and serve BIPOC organizations. BIPOC Oregonians. And so I do believe and understand culturally specific organizations are closely tied to their the population that they are designed and specific and deliberate about serving, and so surely have a really strong representation of BIPOC community within their projects. But I also I do not believe that it is only the job of culture-specific organizations to serve BIPOC community, nor to be culturally responsive to BIPOC community needs. A huge reason for this culturally specific organization set aside and small rural organizations set aside is to make sure that those organizations that are doing the work that are culturally specific or nonprofit that are doing that work to mobilize and support disadvantaged, historically disadvantaged community, should be financially resourced and invested in. And so I think in that vein, really wanting to make sure that we are developing solid policy and directing and using this resource to have the maximum impact, to make sure that we are prioritizing it for where the resources are going to support those organizations that are culturally specific and or rural small nonprofit, and that will be diluted if we agree to use this set aside in all of the partnerships that those organizations form. So we'll need to balance and measure that as we track through. But I think that we, again, going back to the why of the financial set aside makes that feel like brings kind of the good, clearer path of logic there. And I see Carmen's hands back up.
Thanks, Natasha. I want to start by thanking you, all of the OHCS staff, for all of the work and outreach strategies that you've been developing throughout this. You guys have done incredible work and communicating that with us. But I do want to make a clarification on the set aside, the wording here. FHDC has been very vocal that they feel this set aside needs clarification that the nonprofit organization needs to have a minimum amount of years experience on affordable housing, not just, oh, we're a CSO, so we're going to partner with a for-profit developer. They're going to cut us a check for $100,000 in order to use our name, and we're not going to have any say in the development.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, and I did absolutely hone in on that and all of the input and information that we have given and FHDC has provided into those conversations, and I am in complete agreement. I think another piece of what this will also incorporate overall is a pre-qualification process to say, like, really a registry of developers, right? Who is, so that you can be saying, this is our expertise around this is, so we can kind of bring clarity really early on. Who is it we see in the snapshot that you're giving us has the sufficient expertise to both, engage in development and own and operate housing? And where is it that we say, you know what, you can be a co-applicant on something, but that this is, again, the place where you're just getting that, where you're not an active partner in the project, should not qualify for this set aside, and could very well be a culturally specific organization who says, we need housing to serve my population. I'm going to partner with Joe to build my housing, and then it'll serve my population. And that is still a great project and it should get funded, but it should not be derived from this set aside. So I think that is important. Again, the why is in large part to make sure that we are providing resources to invest in projects through your organizations.
Thank you.
All right, we have a number of questions that we will likely need to be following up on. I want to move us into a rapid fire discussion around subsidy limits. So we're going to move into this, and Natasha will provide an overview of current and initial thinking. And then I do have an easy retro board that I'll put in the chat as well. So we're limited on time here. This is really just an introduction. And Natasha, I'll turn it over to you.
Absolutely. And I know very much that everybody wants to understand how much funding can you get for your project that you're working on. And I acknowledge, appreciate, and respect that, and that we haven't shared it yet. Part of what we've been really working to evaluate is, one, we have a legislature who really wants a lot of units produced. So we have key performance measures that we are under about the cost of the projects that you develop. And we need to do a lot of public explaining to the legislature when we do not have costs that are showing up under the metrics that they use to evaluate our work. We also are talking about a non-competitive process. So it is not about wanting to get, giving you points if you're requesting lesser subsidy than the cap. And I think that has a lot of impacts. The one that I really don't want to have is, in terms of why to not point, that is what we need to be is market responsive. We need to be able to work with you as you're working your project through that. So when you're looking at your, in that first evaluation, you might, as I guess we see happen, you think your costs are here, and then as you're completing the due diligence and getting those final construction cost estimates going into that 6 months from readiness, it looks like a different financial picture, and we need to make sure that we can be responsive where we have ability to do so. So the subsidy limit starts to have a very different impact there. It's a number, and we have no other, what are the other levers to make sure that we are surrounding it in reasonability? And we do conduct subsidy layering analyses as a standard course of business to make sure that we're not over leveraging the project. But it felt really critical that we build a perspective to be able to demonstrate, incorporate for us, and also demonstrate to the legislature and others that we are being mindful to the total costs of projects and having sufficient oversight and policy to be able to be comfortable and confident with them. And so on Friday, I will be sharing with Housing Stability Council the draft numbers for that subsidy limit. We are evolving it a little bit in this, at least as a first draft. I'm very curious for all of your input on it. But structuring AMIs per unit based on bedroom size and the AMI that you're going to serve, what your population AMI. We are putting in different limits if it's a new construction versus an ARH rehab project, and then otherwise trying to keep it simple. At the same time, are trying to look at and conceptualize cost evaluation and policy controls that we can talk about as a holistic package that are cost controls. A lot of this is familiar territory to you. Things like policy controls, not allowing cost savings clauses, not increasing developer fee with every project increase of resources. Those are things that already exist. So I don't think that we've had no sight on this before, but again, it's presenting it in this other package. On the cost evaluation, and I think this is something that we continue to evaluate, but we need to create structures around. One of the things that we are actively working to do in engagement with Minnesota that does this is invest, and we've gotten, they've given us some of their, all of the back-end statistical methodology. We're working with economists to say, what does a predictive cost model look like? Not as a point of a hard yes or no, but is if you exceed this by 20%, what this predictive cost model is saying, if you exceed that, then let's make sure that we do a cost assessment as part of this process, and looking at things like a value engineering analysis early in the project, so we can really pinpoint if and when there are future needs for change. What do we think in this project would be worth examining, and what is not worth examining? If you have a playground and you have a family project that needs a playground, that should not be something that we consider eligible to be removed from the project, and to really work it through that. Again, not wanting to step out of the collaborative space, but wanting to make sure that we are looking at this from different dynamics and making sure that we're moving forward. So that is a brief preview of it. We will, again, be planning to share Friday at Housing Stability Council, and then we'll be disseminating that widely to everybody either on Friday or probably Monday of next week.
Yep. Great. And I see some folks have already started adding, we've got a couple of things populated in this easy retro board. And actually, Cassie, if you could stop sharing for a minute, I can share my screen just to show folks, if you're new to using this, it's a pretty simple tool. We've got categories of information around this topic: subsidy limits, cost evaluation, policy controls, all the things that we talked about today. And you just add a plus here and add if you've got specifics that you want to learn more about related to the centralized resource offering. So please feel free to use this. If you have any questions about it, reach out to me and I can help you with this easy retro. And certainly we have a number of questions in the chat that we are going to be addressing as well in follow-up communication. So go ahead, and I think we're going to move into, as we're short on time here, Cassie, I'll stop my share and we can pull up the upcoming engagements and folks can see how they can plug in. Yes, Housing Stability Council meeting on Friday, where subsidy limits will be discussed in more depth. As Natasha mentioned, we'll package up that information and send a technical advisory out early next week. When that video is posted on the Housing Stability Council website, if you're not able to attend on Friday, we want to make sure you can watch that video and hear that discussion. So we will be sending out a communication on Monday about that topic. And then as well, we've got, please mark your calendars for February 12th. We'll talk about capacity building. And then later in February, we have an engagement session planned for February 28th and March 7th. So we will be circling back to you and making sure that we have responses to all of the great questions that you put in the chat today. And don't hesitate to reach out if you have questions in the meantime. So with that, if we've got some folks, we'll do the next slide. I'd like to do just a quick poll here as we're leaving the meeting, wanting to see if you see how this meeting worked for you in terms of did you get the information that you wanted? Did you learn more about the meeting? Now I'm stuck on that poll. So we're gonna skip it, skip this last poll, but please do reach out to me. I'd love your feedback about, how we can make sure that you are getting the information that you need. Here's my email address. So apologies, we weren't able to run this. Oh, got the closing.
I got it out.
I see it. You got it. Okay, great.
I clicked it a bunch of times.
Great. Okay, perfect. It's the quirkiness of Zoom for me.
Yeah.
Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So we appreciate any feedback you have how we can structure this and so that you're able to get the information you need to do your work. So with that, any closing remarks from you, Natasha?
No, I really appreciate it. I see there's a lot of really important and critical questions in the chat, and I do think that we will be responding to them, and we'll figure out exactly how to do that. I think, yes, I agree, Robin, we need to be able to get you the specifics, and I appreciate that, and I cannot tell you I can't probably relate to the degree to which we are working really, really, really hard. And I know you are to move your work forward as well. And so we'll be sharing as much as we can, as soon as we can. And we're getting close in a lot of different places. I also see some affirmation of the question around what happens if this is competitive. Our aspiration is to be able to continue to move forward, to fund projects as much as we can, as much as we have resources to do, and to be able to use that information to be able to relate to the legislature where we can continue to make impact. And so I'm really hoping that we can stay in a place where we don't need to do competition around it, and we'll navigate in through that as soon as we are able to get something, this first iteration launched, as we need to continue to evaluate. So we'll continue to answer the questions, appreciate everybody's insight and perspective. And it looks like overall, most people found this helpful or sort of helpful. So that's pretty amazing. I think 98% felt either sort of helpful or yes helpful. So I appreciate that, and we'll continue to try to do more to help answer the questions that you have to do your business as we create the structure. Thank you so much.
Thanks all.